In small towns, identity was often controlled by whoever kept the records: the church clerk, the county recorder, the census enumerator, walking door to door. If your name was spelled incorrectly, that misspelling could follow generations. If the enumerator skipped your home, you vanished from that year's federal memory. And if prejudice interfered, entire communities could be undercounted. The 1870 census was the first major attempt to standardize this, but it relied on human accuracy, and humans are imperfect. Some formerly enslaved individuals had never had official surnames in 1870. They had to choose one. That single decision shaped family identity forever. A spelling choice, a name selection, an enumerator's handwriting. That's how modern identity began for millions, not through ceremony, but through ink. Before 1870, if you owned land, you were more likely to be documented. Property created paper trails, deeds, tax records, court filings. If you were poor, transient, or landless, documentation was thinner, which means historical survival often depended on wealth. The wealthy left records, the poor left stories, and stories fade faster than paper. That imbalance shaped what we now call history, because history is built on records, and records weren't evenly distributed. So, when you look back at the past, you are often seeing only the people who were documented well enough to remain visible. Everyone else becomes shadow. Before 1870, married women faced another reality: undercoverture laws. A woman's legal identity was often absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't own property independently in many states, couldn't sign contracts freely, and in many census records, she was simply listed under his household. Her legal footprint was limited. Her identity existed socially, but federally thin. It would take decades more reform before women gained fuller independent legal recognition. So when we talk about not existing legally, it wasn't equal. Some people existed less on paper than others, and that hierarchy was built into the system. Now, consider immigrants arriving before 1870. Many came with little documentation. Ship manifests were inconsistent. Names were anglicized, spellings changed at ports or by census takers. A name like Johann Schmidt might become John Smith. And from that point forward, the old identity was gone. For genealogists today, that transformation creates gaps, because the person who arrived isn't always traceable to the person who settled. Documentation didn't just record identity, it reshaped it, and sometimes erased origins entirely. 1870 wasn't just administrative. It marked the beginning of what you could call federal memory for the first time. The government attempted to remember everyone. That shift changed power dynamics, because once a state can systematically name you, it can also categorize you by race, by occupation, by birthplace, by literacy. The census didn't just record existence, it organized society. It created data, and data creates control. That's why censuses became politically sensitive, because counting people determines representation, funding, policy, power. So when 1870 expanded naming, it expanded federal awareness, and awareness is influence. Think about this. If every digital record vanished today, how much proof of your existence would remain? Physical documents, school records, medical files. Now shrink that system back to 1850. That was normal. No backups, no redundancy. Identity depended on survival of materials, fire, flood, war, time, any. One of those could sever the bridge between you and history, and once severed, recovery is almost impossible. That's why so many American families hit the 1870 wall in genealogy. It's not that ancestors didn't live before. Then, it's that federal memory hadn't. fully formed yet. After 1870, the trajectory only intensified. Birth registration became more standardized. In the early 20th century, social security numbers in 1935 created permanent numeric identity. Driver's licenses added photographs. Later, digital databases ensured near-indestructible records. Today, identity follows you from birth certificate to death certificate, from tax filings to hospital records. Invisibility is rare. Before 1870, invisibility was normal. That contrast is staggering for most of human history. Not just in America, governments did not track individuals this thoroughly. Modern identity is recent and surprisingly fragile. In its early stages, we assume existence equals documentation. But that's not historically true. Millions lived full lives before 1870. Loved, worked, struggled, built families, and yet, from a federal perspective, they were faint outlines that doesn't diminish their humanity, but it changes how history remembers them, because remembrance often depends on paperwork, and paperwork depends on systems. 1870 marked the beginning of a stronger system. Not perfect, but foundational. No fireworks announced it, no dramatic speeches defined it, but the 1870 census quietly redrew the boundaries of recognition. From that point forward, being named federally became the norm, and once something becomes the norm, it feels inevitable. But it wasn't inevitable. It was built gradually through policy, through crisis, through war, and reconstruction, and it permanently changed what it were meant to exist in America. Before 1870, you legally didn't exist. It isn't a conspiracy. It isn't an exaggeration. It's a reminder that identity, as we understand it today, is a modern invention. And like all inventions, it evolved. Before 1870, existence was local. After 1870, existence began becoming national. And today, existence is digital, permanent takeblad, which makes the past feel A-B-L, which makes the past feel almost mythical, a time when someone could live an entire life and leave behind almost nothing but memory. And maybe that's the strangest part, not that people didn't exist legally before 1870, but that they existed so freely outside of permanent record, a kind of anonymity that modern society has almost forgotten. And once you understand that, you start to see 1870 not just as a census year, but as the moment America began writing everyone down, and once your name is written, it can never truly be unwritten. Before 1870, you legally didn't exist, not in the eyes of the federal government, not in a national system, not in any centralized record. If you tried to prove who you were, there was nothing official to show. No national birth certificate, no federal ID, no unified record of your existence, and then something changed. A single shift in 1870 quietly redefined who counted as a person in America and who didn't. But to understand what happened, you first need to understand something unsettling. For most of American history, identity was fragile. Today, proving who you are is simple. Driver's license, social security number, birth certificate, digital records. But in early America, none of that existed. Identity was local, scattered, inconsistent. If you were born in 1850, your birth might be written in a family Bible, a church ledger, or nowhere at all. There was no national system tracking citizens, no master list, no central proof that you existed, which meant something dangerous. You could disappear, and no one outside your town would know. The U.S. Census began in 1790, but early census records were extremely limited in many early decades. Only the head of household was named. Everyone else? counted as numbers. Women, numbers. Children, numbers. Enslaved individuals. Numbers, sometimes not even full numbers. If you were a child in 1820, your name might never have been written anywhere federal. You lived, you breathed, you had a family. But on paper, you were statistical background. Now imagine generations of that. 1870 changed everything. For the first time in American history, the federal government required every individual to be listed by name. Not just the head of household, everyone, men, children, formerly. Enslaved people, it was the first census after the Civil War, and it quietly became the foundation of modern American identity records. Why? Because it was the first time millions of people were legally recognized as individuals, not property. Not numbers, but named persons. But here's where it gets unsettling. If your ancestor was born before 1870, there may be no federal proof they ever existed. And if local records were lost, fire, flood, war, they can vanish from history entirely. Entire bloodlines become difficult to trace. Family trees hit walls. Because before 1870, identity depended on fragile systems. Handwritten ledgers, Milltown clerks, churches that burned down courthouses. Destroyed in the Civil War, there was no national backup, no duplicate archive. If paper disappeared, so did you. But the real shift in 1870 wasn't just about paperwork. It was about power. When the federal government started naming individuals, it gained something it had never fully possessed before. A clearer picture of the population, who lived where, who worked what job, who owned land, who didn't. Identity became tied to governance too. Taxation, to voting rights, to citizenship status, and that changed the relationship between the individual and the state forever. The Civil War forced America to rethink identity. Millions had been enslaved before 1870. Enslaved individuals were rarely listed by name in federal records. They were counted for population totals, but not recorded as individuals. After emancipation, there was urgency to document, to define, to legally recognize the 1870 Census became the first large-scale federal acknowledgement of formerly enslaved people as named citizens. But even then, records were inconsistent, spelling errors, missing pages, entire counties destroyed. Recognition had begun, but it wasn't perfect. In the 19th century, records were physical paper, stored in wooden buildings, without fireproof vaults, without digital backups. In 1890, a massive fire destroyed most of the 1890 census records, nearly 90% lost, which created another historical black hole. So even after 1870, identity was still fragile. It would take decades more, and eventually, Social Security in 1935, before Americans had something resembling permanent federal identity documentation. If you've ever tried to trace your ancestry and hit a wall before 1870, this is why. Because before that year, identity wasn't standardized. There was no expectation that the federal government should know who you were. America functioned as scattered communities, and in those communities, your existence depended on ink and memory, not databases, not ID numbers, not federal systems, just paper. If you are alive, you are documented. But that assumption is modern. Before 1870, the concept of federal recognition was still evolving, being real. In a legal sense, depended on property ownership, marriage records, court documents, military service. You didn't interact with institutions. You could move through life with almost no formal trail, which makes one thing clear. Modern identity is not natural. It's constructed. Layer by layer, policy by policy, crisis by crisis. Before 1870, you legally didn't exist. It's not entirely literal. You existed. You had a life, a family, a story. But in the system that would later define citizenship, taxation, voting, and identity, you were largely invisible. 1870 wasn't just another census. It was a turning point. The moment. America began writing down every name, and once names are written, they can be tracked, measured, governed, and sometimes erased. Which raises a final question. In a world where identity is now permanent and digital, is invisibility still possible? Or did 1870 quietly end that forever? Perfect. I'll continue this in the same high-retention style, building tension, emotional depth, and modern relevance, not just repeating facts. This will smoothly extend your 15-minute video and push it towards 17 to 18 minutes depending on pacing. Before 1870, not only was your identity fragile, it was negotiable. If you moved from one state to another, there was no centralized system verifying who you claimed to be. You could change your name, reinvent your past, disappear. From debt escape scandal, start over, and unless someone in your town challenged you, that new identity could stick. There was no fingerprint, database, no federal photo ID, no national birth. Registry.America was a country of reinvention, but reinvention only works when there's no permanent record, and that freedom came at a cost. Because if identity could be rewritten voluntarily, it could also be erased involuntarily.